So I'm going to talk today about loss and economic decisions and what we can learn from the neuroscience of emotion. And when we think about emotion and decision making, one of the ways we've typically thought about this is that there are sort of decisions you make with reason and decisions you make with emotion. And this sort of dichotomy, this notion that there are two systems, is not really aligned with what we know from neuroscience and emotion. So what insights from neuroscience and emotion can inform our understanding of emotion decision making? Well, we know that the brain systems of emotion and cognition are intermixed, intertwined from early perception to complex reasoning. And there are not separate brain systems for emotion and reason. And that different aspects of emotion, such as the feelings you have, the mood you might be in, whether you're stressed or not, did the choice elicit arousal in you, these have unique and specific effects on different cognitive functions, including decision making. So today I want to talk about what we can learn from the neuroscience of emotion about two different behaviors. First, auction behaviors and economic decisions that are risky. I'm going to start with an example from auctions. So I don't know if any of you know the artist Banksy. But Banksy had this work that has received a lot of attention in the art world. I'm going to play you a short video about this work. So here we go.
Shredding this Banksy painting couldn't devalue it. In fact, it just fetched the artist's highest selling price yet, $25.4 million. Back in 2018, Banksy's Girl with Balloon was shredded during a live auction at Sotheby's just after the gavel came down, selling it for $1.4 million. It was a stunt years in the making as the anonymous artist built a shredder into the frame and waited for the perfect time to activate it. After that, the painting was renamed Love is in the Bin, and it was sent on a world tour so Banksy fans could get a glimpse at it for themselves. When Sotheby's announced it was hitting the auction block again this year, they estimated it would sell for up to $8.3 million. It ended up going for 3 times that amount. When will the art world learn? Never underestimate Banksy.
So if you ask the question, what is a Banksy worth? In 2018, this particular piece was worth 1.4 million US dollars, but the pre-auction estimate for that was only about $250,000 US dollars. In 2021, it went for 25.4 million US dollars, but the pre-auction estimate was only about 8.3 million US dollars. So one question is, why so much? And also, how could the Sotheby's pre-auction value estimates be so wrong? So it's well known in economics that one of the things that happens with auctions is people tend to overbid. And I will say this is not just about Banksy paintings and art. This is, there's a website called eBay where you can engage in online auctions. eBay has had gift certificates for eBay. So if you look here, what you'll see is gift certificates for eBay that are $50 are going for $51. So it's not just the art world that overbids in economic auctions. It's a tendency humans have. So why do auctions lead to overbidding? Well, there's really 2 hypotheses emerging from economics. The first is that there's a joy of winning an economic auction, and this joy gets added to the value of the thing that you're bidding for. The second theory is that people are averse to risk, so they bid more so they don't risk possibly losing the thing they're bidding on. So I want to ask the question, does neuroscience favor one theory over another? So to do this, we looked at a brain region called the striatum. So I'll just give you a little primer on the striatum. The striatum is here in green. It codes subjective value. It responds to all types of rewards. It responds to monetary rewards, cooperation, drugs, beauty, and it should also respond to the joy of winning, social rewards. So if you have a benefit from the joy of winning, you might see a boost in signal in the striatum when you win an economic auction. To investigate this, we did an economic auction for The Economist. This is a first price sealed bid auction, so we can know what the Nash equilibrium bid should be. And the way it worked is there were two conditions. You either played an auction with a partner that you met beforehand, and this is actually Andy Schotter, he's an economist at NYU, who was my collaborator on this project, or you played a lottery. And the lottery was simply the number your auction bid was assigned to you, and you either played or you didn't play, and you won or you didn't win. We put people in an MRI scanner, and we had them play these two conditions over and over, and we looked at brain signal in the striatum. So what do we see? So here's the striatum, and what you can see is when we look, just compare when you won money versus didn't, we see a response in the striatum, as you would expect, given that it codes subjective value. And here I'm plotting the lottery condition, and what you see is an increase in response when individuals win the lottery, they just won money, but you see no difference when they lost. Now, if you lost money, you would see a decrease in response in the striatum. But here they didn't really lose anything, right? They just didn't win the lottery. So this makes sense. What about in the auction? Did we see that extra boost in the win signal when they won the auction? We did not. Instead, we saw a large response to losing. So much like in the lottery, when they didn't win the auction, they didn't lose anything, they just didn't win anything. But nevertheless, it looks in this striatum like they actually lost something. In this case, the social competition of the auction. So we showed greater striatal activation, I should say decreased striatal activation to loss relative to gains, and this is inconsistent with the joy of winning hypothesis. And then we looked at the signal in the striatum and we said, when can it predict what you bid on an auction? And we found striatal activation to losses, but not gains, correlated with how much you bid in that auction. So this suggests to us that fear of losing, not joy of winning, may actually be driving overbidding. To investigate this further, we then did a psychological study, a behavioral economics study, where participants did the same sort of first price sealed bid auction, but they had two conditions. They were either, the one we called the loss frame, they came in, they were given $15, and they were told, you have to return this $15 if you lose the auction. The other group had what we called a gain frame. They were told, if you win the auction, you're going to get a $15 bonus. So I just want to point out, the monetary risk is equivalent in these two auctions. So what did we find? We found that emphasizing the loss increases overbidding and leads to a higher profit for a hypothetical auctioneer. And then this suggests to us that loss aversion, or perhaps a threat of loss, may lead to paying too much in auctions. So we then wanted to say, well, what do we know about loss in the brain and the threat of loss? So we asked the question, does monetary loss look like threat in the brain and the body? And what does threat look like in the brain and the body? In the brain, we would expect to see responses in the amygdala. This is the brain's threat detector. It's a brain region that tells you there's something out there that's dangerous for you. In the body, when you experience a threat, you become aroused. You have the fight or flight response. We can measure this in the laboratory by putting little electrodes on your fingers and trying to see, do you sweat a little bit more? And this gives us a sense of your fight or flight reaction to a stimulus. So to see if monetary loss looks like threat in the brain and body, we gave people a series of choices. The choices either looked like this. You could either make a choice, get a 50-50 chance of either winning a large sum of money or losing some money, or getting nothing, so you could choose either option. Or we had choices that looked like this, 50-50 chance, where you could, one choice was to win some money versus get nothing, and the other choice was to take a sure amount. By combining choices like this over a series of trials, we could estimate two parameters. We could estimate lambda, which is your loss aversion, and rho, which is your sensitivity to risk or your risk attitude. Now, I'll tell you right now, we didn't see any relationship between threat responses in the brain and body and risk attitude. So I'm going to focus here on loss aversion. So what do we see? Well, here is lambda for individuals, loss aversion coefficients. People vary in how loss averse they are. In general, people tend to be averse to losses in economic decisions, but here in our participants, we saw some individuals were loss averse, Some individuals were sort of gain-loss neutral, some were gain-seeking. If a lambda equals 1, that means you're gain-loss neutral. But we did see that how aroused you are to losses correlates with your loss aversion. So individuals who showed more of a sweat reaction to losses relative to gains showed greater loss aversion. We also, when we looked in the brain, we saw, again, this striatum codes subjective value that includes your risk attitudes, but the amygdala codes loss aversion. So the amount of amygdala response you see to losses correlates with your loss aversion. So this suggests to us that monetary loss looks like threat in the brain and the body, that your threat reactions to loss predict loss aversion, that your over-arousal to losses relative to gain correlates with loss aversion, and that activation of the amygdala to losses relative to gains also correlates with loss aversion. So then we ask the question, well, if arousal is really driving loss aversion, can I change your emotional response? Can I change your arousal and change your choice? So we did this first by asking the question, can we reduce loss aversion by pharmacologically reducing arousal? And we did this by administering a drug called propranolol. Propranolol is a beta-adrenergic receptor antagonist, a beta blocker, and then it crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's given for high blood pressure. It's not used as much these days as it used to be because it crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it impacts the brain as well. But importantly, with propranolol, it blunts arousal responses in the body and its neurochemical impact in the brain without sedative effects. So we asked the question, would propranolol reduce loss aversion? Participants came into the laboratory. They were given either propranolol or a placebo. They then did a series of gambles like the ones you already saw, and for each we estimated lambda and rho, loss aversion and risk sensitivity. They came back about a week later. They were given whichever one they weren't given before, placebo or propranolol, did a series of gambles. We estimated lambda or rho. And I should say, when we asked participants after the fact, did you know which, if you took the placebo or propranolol, they guessed about 47% correct. So in other words, they had no idea. So can we reduce loss aversion by pharmacologically reducing arousal? Yes. Propranolol reduces loss aversion. It had no impact on risk attitudes. Now this is interesting, right? It provides some experimental proof that it is arousal that is driving your loss aversion, your sensitivity to loss in economic decisions. It's not a very practical means if, say, you wanted to go out into the world and make sure that you are not too loss averse in, say, an auction or a stock trade. So is there a more practical means to reduce arousal and change choices? So here we looked at the research in psychotherapy. If you were to have an anxiety disorder, you might go to a clinician, and one of the things they might do is engage you in cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the things cognitive behavioral therapy does is it does cognitive restructuring. It teaches you that you can have a way of thinking about things that either increases your emotional response or actually decreases your emotional response. And you would see cartoons like this of two cats that have very different attitudes about a dog just by how they interpret that dog. And so emotion regulation, you can be taught to reevaluate or reappraise a stimulus to alter your emotional response. And it's been shown to reduce arousal and the amygdala response to threats. So how might this play out in an economic decision? So what we did in this task was we asked people to make the same type of gambles you just saw under two conditions. We gave them an instruction to either attend to the choice that they're making. So focus on just one choice only, this choice in isolation, don't think about the other choices. And under that condition, we estimated loss aversion and risk sensitivity. In the other condition, we said, okay, this time, I want you to think like a trader. Imagine that you're assembling a portfolio of choices. Only one of these choices is going to be paid out at the end, but you're going to think about the choices as a whole. It's one of many choices that you will make. And again, we can estimate lambda and rho. So when we did this, again, these are the individuals and their loss aversion coefficients. Now I'm going to show you how much did they decrease loss aversion. These are the same individuals in the same order. And what we find is that for almost all individuals, regardless of how loss averse they were to start, using a regulation strategy decreased their loss aversion. We also saw that using an emotion regulation strategy decreased the over-arousal to losses relative to gains. You see that on the left-hand side, where in the attend condition, you see greater arousal to losses relative to gains, where in the regulate condition, you see slightly less arousal to losses relative to gains. It also decreased amygdala activation, as you see on the right. So that's not very, so how might this play out in the real world? So interestingly, there was a study in 2002 published by Andrew Lowe at MIT. And what he did was he took traders on a trading floor. He connected them to devices to measure their physiological arousal response. And he looked at the relationship between physiological arousal and their trading performance, and particularly how they responded to real-life market events. And what he found was that physiological arousal was attenuated in experienced and high-performing traders, individuals who did better in the stock world. And he hypothesized that is because some individuals are actually inclined to not show overreactions to market events, and that makes them better traders. He hypothesized that people were born this way. An alternative hypothesis is that they actually learned to regulate. They used something like the type of emotion regulation strategy you might learn from a therapist to control their reactions to market events, thus not responding to losses so much and performing better in the long run. So I suggested to you today that we have a typical way of viewing the relationship between emotion and reason as two separate ways we can make choices, sort of two different systems we can use for making decisions. But when we think about the neuroscience of emotion, we see that there's really a much more nuanced and complicated relationship between emotion and decision-making and emotion and reason. I've told you that monetary or social loss looks like threat in the brain and the body. And this is true whether you're doing auction bidding or you're making risky choices. And that techniques that we typically use to reduce threat reactions can be adapted to reduce the unwanted impact of loss aversion in economic decisions. So before I conclude, I just want to thank my collaborators on these projects, Andy Schotter, who I already introduced you to, and Mauricio Delgado were part of the auction studies, and Colin Kammerer, a behavioral economist at Caltech, and Peter Sokol-Hessner oversaw the risky choice studies. And finally, I want to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
One is, I was thinking about Madoff,
Oh, yes.
People investing with Madoff. Was that somehow connected to risk aversion? Because Madoff promised that there will be no loss.
Yes.
And a very high, and you wonder why people who were so expert in investing would be, investing with Madoff when it was clear that it was not possible.
I'm sure, loss aversion was part of it. But also, there was a social trust, right, with him. So I think there's another emotional aspect that came into place, right, with Madoff. It was people trusted him, people knew him. He was very much, in the Jewish community, he was very much a leading figure. And so I think both of those things came into play. One, he suggested they would reduce loss, but also make great profit. Two, they also had this connection, another emotional reaction, a social reaction that I think led to more trust.
And then the other question is gamblers.
Yes.
Gamblers seem not to care about loss.
That's not true. So gamblers will double down. right? Once they lose, they don't want to walk away, right? So I think it is the case. You know, they may take a lot of risk, but one of the things where the gambler gets in trouble, is when they're trying to make back their losses, right? They keep going even though they're losing, right? So I don't think it's necessarily the case that gamblers don't care about it. They may tolerate risk more, but I think they're also, at least the ones that don't make money at it are also loss averse.
Would be a good therapy for them.
There's a lot of good therapies for them, but that would be one of them, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Elizabeth.